Good evening. Welcome to another edition of Billy Reads Books. I'm your host, Billy. Tonight on the program, we have the great dialogues of Plato, specifically the Republic. And here is the summary by W.H.D. Rouse. I'm reading this because of how the impeachment trial of Donald Trump has gone. No witnesses will be allowed to testify, and the acquittal is scheduled for this week. It's been a sham, so I think we need to turn to the great Plato to think about what justice and things are. And here I am, going to read one of the W.H.D. Rouse's summary of the Republic. Enjoy my butchering of Greek names. We begin. The Republic. Socrates, Glaucon, Polemarchus, Thyramachus, Adeimantus, and Cephalus. Summary. Book 1. Polemarchus invites Socrates and Glaucon to visit his father Cephalus' house. Various other friends are there as well. Cephalus talks about old age. Eventually, the conversation turns to the subject of justice. How do you define justice? Asks Socrates. Polemarchus puts forward Simondes' definition, to render what is due. But this, on examination, proves unsatisfactory. Here, Thyramachus breaks in, maintaining that the whole conversation so far has consisted of nothing but pious platitudes. Justice, he says, is whatever suits the strongest best. Might is right. A ruler is always just. Socrates suggests that even a ruler sometimes makes a mistake, and orders his subjects to do something which is really not to his advantage at all. Is he just when he does this? Thyramachus answers that insofar as he is mistaken, he is not a true ruler. Socrates then argues that a doctor is primarily concerned to heal the sick and only incidentally to make money. Similarly, medicine seeks not its own advantage, but the advantage of the human body. By analogy, a ruler seeks the advantage of his subjects, not of himself. Thyramachus then rushes off on a new track. Injustice, he says, is virtuous, and justice is vicious. Justice is everywhere at the mercy of injustice, which is reviled not because men fear to do it, but because they fear to suffer it. Socrates sets out to disprove this view, and establishes that justice is apparently wise and virtuous, and at the same time more profitable than injustice. But, he says, he is still without a definition of justice. Book 2. Glaucon and Adeimantus then develop further objections to Socrates' conclusions. Is justice, says Glaucon, any more than society's refuge from the consequences of the doctrine that true success depends on being as unjust as possible? Has it really a value for its own sake? Whereupon his brother Adeimantus adds that everybody is in fact as unjust as he can be without being found out. Is there any value in justice itself, he asks, as distinct from a reputation for justice? At this stage, Socrates suggests that the nature of justice is more easily to be discovered in the macrocosm, the state, than the microcosm, the individual. This is indeed agreed. This is agreed. And the discussion shifts to the origins and composition of a city-state. People associate for mutual support because different men have different abilities. Society flourishes because it is efficient. It enables each person to devote himself to the task he is best fitted for, and saves him from dispersing his energies in other tasks he is not fitted for at all, and which he will therefore perform indifferently. Socrates then describes the various classes of persons in a city, ending with the highest class, the rulers or guardians who require the highest qualities. They must be both courageous and philosophical, both brave and wise. How are these qualities to be developed? This leads to the subject of education, which Socrates says seems to consist of gymnastic for the body and music, in the broad sense of the arts, for the soul. He takes literature, a part of music, first of all, because education begins, he says, in the nursery, with fables and fairy stories. These must be very carefully censored to ensure a suitable moral tone, and in particular, the gods must always appear in a virtuous light. God must be portrayed as the author of good only, not of evil, and as incapable of falsehood. Book 3. Literature, Socrates continues, must deal only with suitable subjects, and only in a suitable manner. He prescribes in some detail as to both subject and form. In effect, the poet may tell only plain stories of virtuous people. The same considerations apply to music, as we mean the word. None but Dorian and Phrygian may the manly and the sober modes are to be allowed, and those rhythms expressive of an orderly and brave life. The practice in the other arts is to be similarly regulated, and in the result a noble art, purified of unwholesomeness and extravagance, will develop in the young the characteristics of nobility. By learning to appreciate the good and the beautiful in art, they will learn to love them in life. In gymnastic, as in music, a wholesome simplicity is prescribed. There will be in the city little disease and few lawsuits, but care must be taken to hold the balance between music and gymnastic. Excess in the former leads to effeminacy, and excess in the latter to harshness. It is a mistake to suppose that music trains the soul while gymnastic trains the body. Gymnastic is as much a part of the soul's education as music is, and the noblest natures, at once brave and wise, require a harmonious blend of the two. From the noblest natures, Socrates goes on, the rulers of the city will be chosen. The best of the older men selected for their devotion to the state by various tests and carefully groomed for office. They will be assisted by the lower class of guardians, the auxiliaries or soldiers. Their rule over the city will be supported by the mystical sanction of the myth of the three metals, gold, silver, and iron. And they will not live the life of princes, but the simple life of soldiers, free from distractions of wealth and luxury. Book 4. Adeimantus remarks that the arrangements for the guardians do not sound very inviting. Socrates replies that this is not the point, even if it is a true criticism, which he doubts. He is concerned not with the happiness of parts, but with one harmonious whole, the happy city. The unity of this city, he says, depends mainly on three principles: equal shares for all, so that there are no rich and no poor; a physical limit of size; and the recognition of merit regardless of birth. These precepts are to be safeguarded by the educational system previously laid down, and all else will then follow. A perfectly arranged city, which will endure as long as the purity of the system itself is maintained. If this is the perfect city, it must contain justice, and besides, wisdom, courage, and temperance. Wisdom, says Socrates, is to be found in the thinking element, the guardians, and it is the knowledge in the light of which they lead the city. Courage or spirit, the quality of the soldiers, is the preserver of the constitution from the twin dangers of war and sedition. Temperance is common to all three classes, and is the harmonious and beneficial relationship between them. Now, for justice, which is the virtue that enables all the others to flourish, and is none other than the old principle put forward in Book 2, by which each class does the work for which it is fitted without presuming upon the preserves of the others. So much for the city. Applying this argument to the individual, Socrates finds that the three classes in the state are reflected in three elements in the soul: the reasoning, the spirited, and the desiring, corresponding to the counselors, the assistants, or soldiers, and the producers. Justice is therefore the due arrangement of these three elements in their proper stations in the soul, namely that the reasoning part rules, with its auxiliary, the spirited part, over the desiring part. Socrates then begins to discuss the nature of injustice and the 5 types of political structure. One type, the only good one, has been dealt with. The other 4 are all more or less bad. Book 5. Socrates is here interrupted by Polemarchus, who asks him to fill in the outline of the perfect city in more detail, before going on to the degenerate ones. This leads to a long digression, the main theme being picked up again at the start of Book 8. After a little preliminary skirmishing, Socrates deals with the position of women in the perfect city. Woman, he says, is the weaker sex, but there are no occupations for which a woman is unfitted merely because she is a woman. He then describes a society in which all institutions and relationships are ruthlessly subordinated to the preservation of the unity of the state, and private life as well as private property are rejected. The city-state thus becomes the smallest as well as the largest. In fact, the only unit of social life. Socrates is just starting to investigate the nature of wars and the difference between civil war and foreign war, when Glaucon asks the fundamental question whether the perfect city, desirable as it may be, can ever possibly be achieved in fact. No, replies Socrates, unless there comes about a union of wisdom and power in the person of the philosopher king. In the rest of Book 5, Socrates defines what he means by philosopher, a lover of wisdom. True knowledge is concerned not with the physical world of the senses, but with the qualities, the realities that are inherent in the everyday world, with beauty, not with beautiful sounds and colors. The changing world of the senses is the object of opinion, but the unchanging world of realities is the object of true knowledge, or wisdom, and it is this wisdom that true philosophers love. Book 6. The guardians of the city, then, are to be true philosophers in this strict sense. Socrates is describing their other good qualities when Adeimantus objects that, in fact, philosophers have a very different reputation of being knaves or fools or both. Socrates explains the reasons for this. A philosopher will never be a popular hero because he has no time to waste on mere party politics, and it is success in this lower sphere alone which earns the plaudits of the crowd. But he admits that a large number of professed philosophers are rascals. Once corruption sets in, the very excellence of the philosophic qualities leads to great temptation and great evil doing. In an unsympathetic, if not actively hostile, world, only a few remain faithful to the principles of true philosophy. These few must be helped and encouraged by means of the educational system already described, but philosophy is not a subject which can be acquired at school or in the teens. It is a lifelong study, and extra faculties must be provided accordingly. Accordingly. In sum, says Socrates, his proposals are desirable if they can be realized, and their realization is difficult, but not impossible. Socrates then reverts to his definition of justice in Book 4. This, he says, was a superficial treatment of the subject. Now he speaks of the highest truth of all, which underlies justice and all the other virtues. This, the idea of the good, the guiding star of the soul, is the end of the philosopher's study. As the sun is to the world of sight, the idea of the good is to the world of mind. He goes on to the 4 divisions of the divided line, a refinement of the distinction between these 2 worlds, already sketched in Book 5. The physical world of the sun, the domain of opinion, contains its lower class images, such as shadows and reflections, and in its higher class physical objects, such as animals and trees. The corresponding division in the world of mind, the domain of knowledge, is between, on the one hand, concepts of a mathematical type, which depend on given postulates, and on the other hand, the eternal verities, the ideal or ideals comprehended by dialect in the light of the idea of the good. The 4 categories are the subjects of conjecture, belief, understanding, and the exercise of reason respectively, and partake in ascending order of clearness and truth. Book 7. Socrates goes on to the story of the cave, which illustrates the escape of the philosopher from the fetters and darkness of the physical world, of the senses, to the freedom and dazzling radiance of the world of mind. But, he says, the philosopher must afterwards return to the cave to enlighten and set at liberty those still imprisoned there. How is this escape made possible? By the study of a class of subjects which deal in abstractions. These are arithmetic, the study of numbers, and, of less importance, plane and solid geometry, astronomy, so far as it concerns the principles of movement of solids, and harmonics, the study of sound. All these have a practical application, but their real value lies in their power to lead the soul out of the darkness of the changing world of the senses towards the light of the unchanging world of mind. Fortified by these exercises in abstract thought, the soul at last learns, through the study of dialect, to comprehend the idea of the good. In the last part of Book 7, Socrates describes in more detail the practical application of his curriculum. After the standard education in music and gymnastic, the selected student passes on to the abstract subjects, and thence to dialect, with frequent tests on the way. The few who reach the summit at about the age of 50, and Socrates reminds his hearers that they may be men or women, divide the rest of their lives between philosophy and the affairs of state. Finally, Socrates repeats that his proposals will only be realized by a philosopher king. An unlikely combination, perhaps, but not an impossible one. Book 8. The perfect city and the kingly or aristocratic character having now been fully described, Socrates reverts to the point reached at the end of Book 4, and proceeds to deal with the 4 degenerate forms of constitution and the 4 corresponding types of individual. The aristocratic constitution degenerates into the timocratic, or honor-loving, when the warrior class prevails over the wisdom-loving class, and imposes a militant policy dictated by ambition and the love of glory. Similarly, in the soul of the democratic man, the spirited part gains precedence over the reasoning part, and the result is a valiant but contentious and ambitious nature. The timocratic constitution degenerates into oligarchy, the rule of the few, when honor-loving turns to money-grubbing. The city is divided into rich rulers and poor subjects. In the soul of the oligarchic man, pleasure-loving but ungenerous, the desiring part prevails over the reasoning and spirited parts. The oligarchic constitution degenerates into democracy, the rule of the people, when the poor in the oligarchic state revolt. All are then set free to do as they wish, and, says Socrates in effect, to go to the devil in their own way. Where the oligarchic man, thrifty at heart, gave way only to the money-making or necessary desires, the democratic man, casting off even this restraint, gives free rein to the spendthrift or unnecessary desires, and liberty is thus complete. The democratic constitution degenerates into tyranny, when men tire at last of the lawlessness of a liberty which has become license. They appoint a strong man to restore order. He raises a bodyguard or private army to suppress the irresponsible elements in society, and unperceived tyranny is established in the city. Book 9. The tyrannic man, continues Socrates, is ruled by the worst class of the unnecessary desires. To the lawlessness of the democratic man, he adds the frenzy of lust. Utterly without scruple, he is driven to boundless excess by passions he can never sate. The tyrannic man, like the tyrannic state, is slave to fear, want, every sort of misery, and every sort of wickedness. He is last in happiness, below the kingly man, the oligarchic man, and the democratic man, in descending order. This is Socrates' first answer to Thrasymachus' argument in Book 1, that injustice is more profitable than justice. He continues with another. The three elements in the soul distinguished in Book 4 lead the three classes of men in which they respectively rule in pursuit of wisdom, honor, and pleasure. Each class will maintain its own aim to be the highest, but clearly the best opinion will be that of the wisdom-loving or philosophical man, because he will be the most experienced and the best equipped to judge. We must agree with him that wisdom-loving is superior to honor-loving, and honor-loving to pleasure-loving. Yet a third argument follows. Socrates analyzes the kinds of pleasure enjoyed by the three classes. The philosopher's pleasure in wisdom is best because it partakes most of the unchanging world of truth and real being. The pleasures of victory and honor come next. The last of all is the pleasure of gratified desire, which is no more than a fleeting shadow of true pleasure. Finally, Socrates deals with the question raised by Glaucon and Adeimantus in Book 2, whether justice is valuable for its own sake. The three elements in the soul are likened to a man, a lion, and a monster. In the soul of the just, the man rules. In the soul of the unjust, the monster rules. Clearly, the first condition is intrinsically of more value than the second, and a spurious appearance of justice cannot make injustice any more praiseworthy. Socrates ends Book 9 by saying that whether or not the perfect city exists on earth, it is laid up in heaven as a pattern for mankind. Book 10. Socrates now returns to his criticism of the artist. He distinguishes three levels of reality, instancing the ideal bed, the bed you sleep on, and the image of a bed in a picture. The artist functions at the lowest level. He only portrays the actual, not the ideal bed. Art is mere imitation of an appearance of reality. Now, imitation is essentially an activity inferior to doing or making. And moreover, the artist will never even be able to imitate particularly well, because his knowledge of his subject is bound in every case to be inferior to a practical knowledge of it. However diverting, art cannot be a serious occupation. Nevertheless, art does appeal to some element in the soul. Not, says Socrates, the rational element, but the irrational. In literature, for example, the poet will not imitate the reasonable man, but the foolish and unstable man, because the latter will, he thinks, give more scope for effect, and will also be a more congenial subject for the foolish and unstable part of the soul. The tendency of art to corrupt even the best of natures, by thus encouraging the lower element at the expense of the higher, is all the more dangerous because of art's undoubted fascination. And the soul, in pursuit of virtue, must be ceaselessly on guard against it. The last section of Book 10 follows the fortunes of the just and the unjust to the afterlife. Everything, says Socrates, has its own evil, tending to corrupt and destroy, and its own good, tending to preserve. The soul is corrupted by its evil, vice, but is not destroyed by vice. It is hardly likely, therefore, to be destroyed by the evil of the body, disease. In fact, disease and death do not affect the soul at all. Obviously, they do not make it more unjust. The soul, therefore, does not perish with the body. In the afterlife, as on earth, it fares according to its deserts. The just soul being eternally rewarded, and the unjust soul eternally punished. With the fable of in which these conclusions of the argument are given mystical form, the Republic ends. Well, that was a whole lot of thoughts. And, wonder what you think of it. Let me know in the comments below. Remember to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. And I'll see you next week.